Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth of our Chifley conversations for 2022. Tonight, we're having a conversation with Dr Andrew Leigh, who's joining us from Canberra. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to country. The office of the Chifley Research Centre is located on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I'm speaking to you tonight from the land of the Gadigal people. Andrew Leigh is also joining us from the land of the Ngunnawal people. And we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we're speaking from and those on the lands on which you are joining us from tonight. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Well, for those of you who don't know him, and I suspect there will be very few people who don't know Andrew, Andrew's the Shadow Assistant Minister for Treasury and Charities, and he's now been the federal member for Fenner for quite a few years. Before he came to Parliament, Andrew was a Professor of Economics at the Australian National University, and he's been a past recipient of the Economic Society of Australia's Young Economist Award, and he's also a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. Around that, he manages to fit in running a family, an electorate, a bit of triathlon, a bit of marathon running, and hosting a podcast, which many of you may have heard of, The Good Life. If you haven't heard it, I recommend it. He quite often has some good tips about leading a healthier and happier and more ethical life. Andrew's produced a number of books. I won't go into all of them tonight, but most importantly, we're here tonight to talk about the effects of automation and digitalisation. Andrew has visited that subject before many of us have been thinking about it in a book that he produced in 2019 with Joshua Gann. So this is not the first time Andrew's been speaking about this, and he can bring to bear a bit of experience. So I want to begin tonight by asking Andrew about some of the current debates, recently, particularly in the US, with Joe Biden's Build Back Better programs. Many prominent US figures have raised their fears about the apparent breakdown in the links between equitable economic growth outcomes and claimed productivity-focused automation. It used to be thought that these things went hand in hand, but you're getting a number of people, most notably and recently Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and some well-known economists like Roma, Stiglitz, and perhaps most prominently Doran Acemoglu, who've been saying that they're not entirely convinced the links stack up these days, and that we might be experiencing a bit of automation for automation's sake, which is producing some adverse outcomes, particularly as far as inequality goes. Yet there are other people who question this. When we were talking about having this session, Andrew drew my attention to something that was recently in what used to be called the Economist newspaper, but it's now the Economist website, which says we should be more sceptical than some of these US economists in particular have been about the claims. So we're here tonight to discuss and learn about who's right, and is there a distinct Australian context. Andrew, would you like to give us your thoughts just to kick things off?
Well, thanks so much, David, for your introduction. I'd open, as you did, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you today. And Dowra Nuna, Dowra Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nullamunyan, Dunimunyan, Ngunnawal Wadi, Dowra Wadi, Dindi, Wangarlin Yin. And acknowledge any Indigenous people on the call tonight. I want to acknowledge too anyone of Ukrainian Australian heritage, who I imagine is having a pretty rough day today, and just to know that our thoughts are with you and with your family. David, the question as to what automation is going to do to jobs is an age-old one, going back at least to the time of the Luddites and the breaking of mechanical looms, through to the suggestion of Keynes that automation might have massive impacts on employment, reducing the average work week to just a few hours. Now, over recent years, though, there's a few things we can say about job losses and technology. One of the most useful typologies, I think, is to split up jobs into three categories. Manual jobs, hairdressers, security guards, routine jobs, think bookkeepers and those who are processing check-in claims, retail checkout workers, and abstract jobs, architects, lawyers, surgeons. And if you split jobs into those three categories, you see something very interesting. That is that job growth has been fairly strong among manual jobs and abstract jobs over the past generation, but much weaker among routine jobs. So those jobs that workers are repetitive tasks. Well, that was first shown in a study in the United States, then in Europe, and recently in Australia by work from Jeff Borland and Mick Coeli. So I find, David, that that's the most useful way of envisaging what technology is doing to jobs so far. But of course, that doesn't tell you what's going to happen in the future. One of the things about artificial intelligence is it's what's known as a general purpose technology. General purpose technologies often don't show up so quickly in the productivity statistics. When electricity was introduced to factories, the first thing that factory owners did was to take the machines, which had previously been driven by a sort of Byzantine system of pulleys and drive chains, and instead run power cables through. Turned out that didn't have a big impact on productivity. And it took a while before they realised they could actually rework the entire factory, that they didn't have to have the machines close together as back in the pulley age and steam engines, but they could separate them apart. And then productivity kicked in. People may be familiar with the line from the late 1980s that the productivity age was showing up, the computer age was showing up everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And in part, that's because the early use of computers in offices was to take the place of the typing pool. There wasn't a fundamental changing of the way in which work operated. But increasingly, as people came to realise that computers allowed you to carry out work differently, to have people working on laptops, working from home, moving files around, and therefore servicing clients further afield, that the productivity impact really kicked in. And something similar might be going on with artificial intelligence right now. It could well be that we're not seeing the big tick up in productivity just yet, but it's going to come. We certainly need to hope it comes, because productivity growth has been lousy. Productivity has been going backwards in recent years. And if you look at the past decade, productivity growth has been the worst in the post-war era, and consequently, income growth has been the worst. Income growth is partly down because workers aren't getting their fair share of the pie, but it's also just the case that the pie isn't growing as fast. So how should progressives like us think about the rise of robots? One important perspective, I believe, is to be circumspect about what we can predict. A famous study from the Oxford economists, Frey and Osborne, estimated that some 47% of jobs would be automated away. It got headlines and certainly generated a frisson of excitement. But when you delve deeper, you start to scratch your head at their findings. Those findings are based on hand coding occupations, essentially asking experts how automatable they think a particular job is. It's not based on how job loss has occurred. It's an overall prediction based on experts' best guesses. But if we know one thing about occupational forecasting, is that it makes astrology look respectable. If you go back to the late 1990s and you look at the occupational forecasts from the then Department of Employment, and you plot them against the actual occupational growth figures, you get basically a graph like if you flicked a bunch of ink onto a page. There's very little correlation between the occupations that the Department of Employment predicted would grow and those that actually grew. They predicted, for example, that mining would shrink, but the China shock led to quite the opposite. And they were pretty circumspect about healthcare, a sector which ended up growing very rapidly, as did international education. Trade and technology are fundamentally discontinuous processes. So it's pretty hard to pick what's going to kick in. So we should be very wary about anyone that tells us that we can reimpose some sort of a command and control system that will allow us to tell young people what they should go out and study in order to be in the best robot-proof occupation. The world just isn't that simple. But we do know that technology universally has been skill biased. That is, that technological advances are better for those with more skills than fewer skills. In a law office, for example, automation has increased the productivity of the partners in the corner offices who can communicate electronically and use artificial intelligence machines to do discovery faster. But it's hurt the wages of the person that cleans that corner office, who's now competing with a robot vacuum cleaner. So we need to improve the quantity of education people receive. That has to do with making sure that our schools are working as well as they can and not seeing this backsliding in test scores that we've seen in the OECD PISA tests for the better part of the past 2 decades. We've now got to a stage where there's almost a full year of learning lost, meaning that a year 8 student in 2000 would score about as well as a year 9 student does today. We've got to turn that around, and teacher quality, I think, is the heart of that, attracting and retaining the very best teachers. We've seen a collapse in apprentices and traineeships and boosting the quality and quantity of TAFE education is absolutely vital. Our free TAFE places approach will help with that. We need to make sure more people go to university. I've never figured out why the coalition, despite having a cabinet that's almost entirely university educated, with the exception of David Littleproud, want to wage this culture war on the universities. They should take a smarter approach and recognise that if the robots are coming, the best way of combating them is through a great education. So we need to expand more of those university places. And at any time we're thinking about education, we want to be thinking about broad-based skills. Some of the findings that are coming out now about apprenticeships suggest that while the German apprenticeship model, which has hundreds of specific apprenticeships, is very good at alleviating youth unemployment, it doesn't do so well for workers in their 50s. Because by the time they're in their 50s, very often technology has moved and made it difficult for someone that has narrow caste skills. So more education and broad-based skills. Finally, we need to get unionisation back up again. Unions have been important in improving skills of workers, but also in ensuring that workers get their fair share of productivity gains. In the early 1980s, half the Australian workforce is in a union. Now it's down to just 1 in 7. And what that means is that you don't just have the loss of an institution which fought for the 8-hour day, the weekend, and occupational health and safety laws, but you've got workers increasingly atomised and unable to have stable, fulfilling jobs. Yes, we've managed to bring the unemployment rate down. I think that's a good thing. But the stability of work and having jobs that pay well enough to raise a family and pay a mortgage is one of the things that's profoundly under threat. The wage growth figures that came out yesterday suggest that in real terms, wages have gone backwards in the coalition's most recent term in office. An absolute indictment on their economic model. Turning that around requires strong unions to make sure workers get their fair share, but it also requires productivity boosting reforms, education, infrastructure, and the institutions that ensure we've got a more dynamic economy. It's a fascinating area, David, and very happy to take your questions and those of the participants who've done us the courtesy of joining us tonight.
Well, we'll get to those questions in a minute, Andrew, and I'd ask people who've got questions to post them on the Q&A section rather than the chat section, and we'll try and get to them after I've had a bit of a go first. But if I can try and pull together the threads of what you're saying, I mean, you're essentially saying we're not dealing with a binary trade-off here. It's a complex, multi-dimensional dimensional issue, a bit akin to what happened to, say, some of the Club of Rome predictions about population and food. We're not, in the case of the Club of Rome, we didn't all end up starving, and you're saying we're not all going to end up losing our jobs. But I also noticed that there were a lot of mights in the initial stages of your presentation about where we might go. And I also noticed that you were focusing a lot on those entering the workforce or capable of being trained better at early stages in their periods in the workforce. And indeed, you cited the German apprenticeship system and saying that, that was not proving necessarily the best system when you're dealing with people towards the end of their working lives with highly specialised skills. That, of course, is held up as an exemplar of perhaps where we should have been or where we should still continue to go in terms of vocational training here in this country. And then we've also got the question of people who are in the workforce, who are either marginalised out of the workforce because their skill level, they don't even have apprenticeship training. Their skill levels are somewhat lower. They're either semi-skilled or barely skilled. And the contention is that they could either be forced out of the workforce by some sort of process that is in effect turning that part of the labour market into a commodity, turning human capital into a commodity, which is contingent on automation and how it's applied, or otherwise they could be forced into more and more marginal jobs with more and more wages, touching on the problem that you finished with, which is some of the inequalities in the labour market. And I suppose pulling all of those threads together as a bit of a summary, and perhaps a provocative summary from your point of view, what I'd want to ask is, okay, I can understand what you might be saying in terms of restoring the strength of unions and therefore the power of labour. I can understand what you are saying about improving all forms of education and training and better equipping people to be adaptable. But what about people who are in the middle and the end of their careers, who are finding that particularly those near the end is going to come prematurely, and they are completely marginalised. They're, perhaps in a worse position than those German workers that you were talking about in terms of their capacity to reskill or redeploy themselves. How do we deal with that? Surely they must be proof of some of these arguments that are being mounted in the States. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, both economically and politically, David. Yeah. There's a lovely book by Michael Sandel that's come out recently, which is on meritocracy and speaks about, it's called The Tyranny of Meritocracy. And he's very critical of the Tony Blair approach to say that the solution to automation was education, education, education. Perhaps I steered into making that mistake too much tonight. But I do think it's vital that progressives recognise the dignity of labour and don't mistakenly suggest that people are able to do more retraining than they can. So we should be open to ideas such as wage subsidies, which have proven effective, and also ensuring that government programs create new jobs. Too often government programs are touted as on the basis that they will generate 1,000 new jobs. But when you look at the fine print, you'll frequently find that the sorts of people they're looking for are the kind of high-skilled workers who'll be pulled from other employment. Whereas if you're generating jobs in remote Indigenous communities, for people with disabilities, in high unemployment areas, then you're creating new jobs. And governments should be very open to doing that, particularly for those who have struggled to find work in the paid workforce. I'm a skeptic of universal basic income. My read of the life satisfaction literature or the happiness literature is that the drop in happiness that accompanies losing your job is far bigger than what you'd expect from the loss of the paycheck. And indeed, it suggests that you'd have to compensate someone by $50,000 to $100,000 a year more than they were earning to make up for the happiness loss that comes from losing a job. So I don't think universal basic income is the answer. I think we want to figure out how to extend work more broadly. Now, part of that is through better trade training. I don't want to, because I'm being critical of narrowcasting on apprenticeships, I don't want to be critical of trades as a whole. One of my German friends illustrates the difference when he says if he's in Germany and somebody who is in a trade spies an attractive person across the other side of the bar, then they will sidle up and their opening line will be, "I'm a carpenter." In Britain, he says the same scene unfolds, but the person will say, "I'm a Manchester United supporter." He says there's a pride in a German carpenter in knowing that that person is a great craftsperson, and engendering that pride and valuing it as a society is really, really important. But the Swiss have fewer categories of apprentices, and in Switzerland, the earnings of trades workers hold up better in their 50s than they do in Germany. So yes to trades training, but no to a very narrow form of trades training that makes it difficult for workers to move when technology shifts.
Can I just tease that out a bit? I mean, I would like to get to, I suppose, the notion of what you're putting forward, that government policy should be as mindful of psychic income as much as it is of monetary income. We'll get to that. But first of all, for the audience, tell us a bit more about this this Swiss system with less categories. Is it sort of broader streams of apprenticeship training and skills? How does it work?
Yes, you can think of it as being the difference between training somebody solely as a cabinet maker and training them more broadly across carpentry. So providing the skills for someone to shift in the event that suddenly cabinet making disappears and carpenters move towards, there's growth in home construction, for example. You just don't want to lock yourself in too narrowly, David, and that holds true at university as well. The more narrowly someone is trained, if they're trained just on one computer language or one very specific task, it's harder for them to shift. And indeed, I think that's one of the fallacies in the way in which the government has approached their so-called job-ready graduates package. It's devaluing social sciences and the humanities, failing to recognise that actually social sciences and humanities graduates come into their own as they go through their career because that's a much more flexible base of skills than a very narrow science training in one narrow discipline of science that might be vulnerable to technological disruption.
So in essence there, you're arguing that perhaps we should be looking at more a US East Coast or Melbourne model of higher education where people have if they're in an art stream, they have a broad liberal arts first degree, or if they're a science person, they have a broad sciences degree. That might become a bit more specialised, depending on the type, whether it's an abstract science or, say an environmental science, and then you would go on. So that says to me that you may have some concerns about the drift overall to a more credentialist approach in Australia among the bulk of our universities.
Yeah, spot on, David. I think university is not about learning facts. It's about learning to think and learning to learn, that ability to engage in ongoing education. And that's not just something that lawyers will have to do. It's also something that a mechanic will need to do. Right. If you can only fix a person-driven petrol-powered car, then you're likely to only be capable of washing the wheels of a driverless electric vehicle. Whereas if your training teaches you to learn, you'll be better able to pick up those modules. And increasingly, we're doing better at incorporating that kind of modular education into formal credentials. You think about the education modules that are provided through Khan Academy or through the Microsoft training, providing a little bit of approved credentials to that, linking them up with the formal education system makes a lot of sense to me, because then for someone who's a bit reluctant to go back to university for 6 months or a year, they might be quite happy doing that 2-day refresher course, and they should have that formally recognised.
Right. We might just turn to some of the audience questions if we can, Andrew. Gregory Westlake makes the point that necessity appears to be the mother of invention. So that, what might, and then he's asking, well, given that, what's going to drive innovation in Australia's use, I presume, of robotics and artificial intelligence if we continue the current drift of where our population policies are going, by having streams of that are effectively about importing cheap labour. And, I would assume that the changes we've seen in the last month or two about how student visas are categorised is a classic example of that. They've in effect become tests for guest worker passes rather than what was a measured stream where people could have a permanent education visa that over time, as they acquired skills, they could convert into a working credential. So Gregory's asking, if we're having this thing where we appear to be increasingly willing to tolerate the exploitation of migrant labour for simple repetitive tasks in sectors like, for example, agriculture. We could also mention some areas of hospitality, for example. Won't we be having another lost opportunity? And it's, obviously all very well to talk about these things at the moment, but won't we have another situation like we could very nearly have had on renewable energy?
Yeah, Gregory, I think this is a great question. Traditionally, the difference between American and Australian migration has been that we've drawn in higher skilled workers, such as doctors, whose services are consumed by the whole population, and which puts downward pressure on the price of medical services. In the US, they've had disproportionately low skilled workers, childcare workers, cleaners, gardeners, and that has put downward pressure on the prices that affluent households pay for getting a nanny or for getting a gardener, and downward pressure on the wages in that sector. One of the reasons I think that the Australian migration program has enjoyed such strong success has been a points system based on skills, combined with the willingness to dial back migration in periods of higher unemployment in order to maintain popular support for the program. But I think it can be better. I spoke before about the problems of predicting outcomes based on occupational categories. I think that's true if you're advising a young person what to study, but I also think it's true if you're advising a government as to who to let in. And moving to a system which allocates temporary visas based on wages rather than skill categories would make much more sense to me. So where you set the wage threshold is ultimately a political decision, but making sure that those who come in are effectively competing with workers on six-figure salaries rather than with workers on the minimum wage. That's a very straightforward way of ensuring that you don't have people rorting the categories by finding an in-demand occupation where migrants are going to be competing with minimum wage workers. And that can then be supplemented with something like the Pacific Seasonal Migrant Scheme, which is much better managed than allowing backpackers a second year on their visa if they go and pick fruit, because you've got oversight of the employers and you've got a skills transfer to the region. So many of our Pacific remitters, but also through the know-how that's come from that program. So that'd be how you can be more comfortable with the growth of automation and less inclined to worry that automation will rob jobs.
Right. Catherine Burns asking, are there any particular areas of work, as opposed to people with differential levels of skills, that are most vulnerable to automation?
So, Catherine, I feel like you're tempting me to try and contradict myself. I think it's a great. I feel that you've dug a really deep hole with lots of sharp sticks at the bottom. You've carefully covered it with branches, and you've just called from the other side of the forest. Andrew, could you just walk over here for a moment? Because really, if I believe what I've told you so far, then I shouldn't be out there naming occupations. The moment I start saying there's a great future in solar installing or being a wind turbine engineer, is the moment that I'm starting to engage in the very practice that I've told you hasn't been fall back on that fundamental that we know to be true, that progressively, as technology has advanced, skills have become more and more in demand. There's a lovely book by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz called The Race Between Education and Technology. And their theory is as simple as the title. If you want to understand what drives inequality, think about how fast technology is advancing and how fast education is advancing. If education runs faster than technology, as it did in the post-war era, you get wage compression. You get wages growing faster for workers than CEOs. But if technology advances while education stagnates, the story of America in the last generation, you get runaway inequality and the social dislocation that follows.
More by way of comment than question, Paul Loring's suggesting that when we talk of productivity, we're actually really using a euphemism for replacing human labour with machines. And that with AI, we're getting to the point where we'll not just be replacing labour, but we'll be replacing decision-making roles with, I suppose, virtual machines. And he's saying the beneficiaries are those who hold the capital to enable that to occur, i.e. Companies, but the state is left with the cost of having to assist the people who may have been displaced, and that we don't properly recognise this. I suppose if you pull together a question out of all of this, it's should individual enterprises that implement what appears to be purely labour-saving productivity changes through capital investment, should they bear some direct responsibility for the possible downsides of what they've done?
So, Paul, I think it's a fabulous question that goes right to the heart of what productivity is. Ultimately, productivity is not working harder. It should be working smarter. Our labour productivity is simply measuring the average amount of output from an Australian worker in a given hour. And that has increased markedly since the time of federation. I think it's a 7-fold increase, which is translated directly into wages. So in buying power terms, the typical Australian now can buy more with a day's wage than an Australian worker in 1901 could buy with a week's wage. That productivity has been, to a large extent, a function of technological advances. But we do need to make sure that that technology is advancing in a way that is complementing labour rather than crowding it out. I was a little worried at the start of the pandemic when the government put in place a big tax break for firms that were buying up a lot of machinery. The risk at that time that was concerning me and American scholars such as Elizabeth Reynolds and David Order were that subsidising automation at a time of high unemployment could make joblessness worse. I think as unemployment has come down, my concerns about that have softened somewhat. And that's why I'm pretty sceptical about ideas such as Bill Gates' proposal for a robot tax. I don't think we want to stop automation, but I do think that going hand in hand with automation should be strong unions. And that's the best way of ensuring that workers are going to see their wages rise alongside automation rather than see their jobs disappear.
Right. We're getting some comments in the chat and also some questions turning to the education side of things and the skills formation side of things. And I'll start with one from Leonie Lane, who's asking, how do we get basic literacy and numeracy and digital skills back into the education agenda? And the reason why she's asking this is because she believes that so many people actually can't even get good basic skills to begin with, and that might be a cause of us losing the benefits of valuable human capital. In Leonie's view, these skills used to be an integral part of TAFE, providing people with a platform, a pathway, as it were, into higher level courses and being able to do different things in the future. What have you got to say to that?
Yeah, Leonie, I think you're spot on about the importance of having those computational thinking skills, not necessarily on a narrow level. I learned the basic programming language when I was in high school. I spent many weekends programming away on my Aquarius computer, which had 3.5 kilobytes of memory, and my VIC-20 with 20 kilobytes of memory. But the skills I learned out of being able to program BASIC aren't very much use to me today. What would have been more useful is developing a better understanding of probability and statistics, which I think we don't teach well enough at schools, and which could usefully be expanded at the expense of, for example, trigonometry, which tends to be used only in a narrow range of workplaces. But fundamentally, all of this becomes easier the more we're drawing teachers from the very top of the aptitude distribution. I did some work with Chris Ryan, who's now at the University of Melbourne, looking at the academic aptitude of those entering the teaching profession from the early 1980s to the early 2000s. And we found that in the early 1980s, the typical teacher was at the 70th percentile of the aptitude distribution. By the early 2000s, they were at the 62nd percentile. The Grattan Institute has extended that work on and found a commensurate fall over the last 2 decades. So increasingly, we're not doing as good a job as we should be at drawing teachers from the very top of the aptitude distribution. Now, a good player doesn't always make a good coach. Academics alone don't tell you whether you've got the emotional skills, for example, to convey challenging concepts. But all else equal, I think we'd like someone at the whiteboard who themselves was able to master that subject. That's partly about what we pay new teachers. It's partly about ensuring that new teachers aren't struggling with paperwork and other forms of busy work that are distracting them from being educational leaders. And the thoughtful work of the Grattan Institute around that, I think, is really useful in figuring out how we might better hone that part of the education system.
Is there any merit in perhaps also repurposing skilled white-collar workers whose roles might be threatened through automation or more particularly digitalisation at the end of their careers, and also may, because of better health outcomes, want to be working longer anyway because we're all living longer, and having people who have been trained in other disciplines and have had solid white-collar careers in other disciplines, having them repurposed as teachers, as it were, as a perhaps quick and dirty way of solving some of the issues you've just identified, with the ability of those entering the teaching workforce.
One of my favourite ads aimed at exactly this purpose, David, was New York City schools that ran subway advertisements that said, "You remember your 3rd grade teacher's name. Who will remember yours?" And it was an ad for a program called Teach Next, which was encouraging successful professionals to make a late career transition through to teaching.
Yeah.
One of the participants in the program was a high caliber scientist who had run out of ideas at the bench, but wanted to convey them to school students, and did so extraordinarily effectively. Writers have turned back into becoming English teachers, statisticians into becoming maths teachers. We've tried that sort of teach next approach on a small scale, and it hasn't been, the results have not been as successful as I would like them to be. But it does suggest that we want to have more pathways into teaching and recognise that you can do portions of the training on the job. So the Teach for Australia model, which has an intensive block of teacher education training and then ongoing training through the next 2 years, has proven pretty effective. Teach for Australia teachers produce test score results at least as good as those that are coming through regular training channels. So doing something similar for mid-career entrants makes loads of sense to me.
Okay, and do these programs produce enough volumes of teachers? I mean, you hear famous examples of them and they sound very public spirited. I mean, one of the examples I can think of is the former Financial Times journalist Lucy Kellaway. And I think she's actually made 2 career transitions. I think she started off as a business person and then did what was a more traditional tradition and became a media commentator. And then she's since gone back to be a teacher. But I'm just wondering, are these vanity projects or do they produce sufficient numbers of people to make a real difference?
Yeah, they're somewhere in between at the moment. I think you're exactly right to be sceptical about this as being an entire solution. One useful thing they do, though, is that many of those who go through Teach for Australia stay in the education field overall. So I think it's about a half stick in teaching, but of those who leave, many go into areas like becoming principals or working in departments of education, where their direct experience of teaching, very frequently in a disadvantaged school, turns out to be useful. But fundamentally, I think these programs are giving us new ideas for tweaking existing teacher education programs rather than being in any sense a substitute for them.
Right. If we move on from teacher education and the school system to TAFE, Kevin Hayes very much agrees with your views about the need to increase broader-based skills training, and clearly agrees with some of your comments about micro-credentials, etc. But he's wondering, how do we get the balance right between having, say, these micro-credentials and also broad-based foundational skills with a full range of certificates, diplomas, degrees, whatever? Particularly, how do we also revitalise the TAFE colleges as centres of learning to support a model that can do these things simultaneously?
Yeah, Kevin, it's a great challenge and one that I've been wrestling with too. I think TAFE has been run down for too many years, and I know talking to Tanya Plibersek, it's something that's a big concern of hers. One of the things we ought to be looking at is better joining up TAFEs and universities. My colleague Jim Chalmers talks about Logan TAFE and the Logan campus of Griffith University, which are literally a stone's throw away from one another on opposite sides of a highway. And yet Jim says there's much too little interplay between the two campuses. Ensuring we do a better job of joining up TAFE and university could potentially take you to what I think is one of the useful bits of the US system, the idea of 2-year and 4-year colleges. That's a principle that says that if you start at a 2-year college, you can then go on to complete a degree at a 4-year college. Whereas at the moment, we have a system where it's very hard to transition between the two. And it's also difficult to pick up the skills that TAFEs teach if you're studying at university. So we ought to make it easier for somebody who is studying at TAFE to take the occasional course at university, but also for someone who's studying at university to take, if they're studying landscape architecture, to easily take a horticulture course at TAFE. And that kind of interplay might provide a better foundational skills.
Yeah. John McQueen's sort of asking, how do we balance the market to facilitate these sorts of things? He's saying for manufacturing to continue to exist in Australia and for us to produce globally competitive products that can compete outside of trade and tariff barriers, how do we achieve a sweet spot of ensuring that there's good, livable, real wages and also a capacity to provide a globally competitive product, whether that product is a good or a service? In essence, balancing the laws of supply and demand versus some of the equity demands domestically.
Yes, ensuring that we've got a good manufacturing base, I think, is really important for Australia. Manufacturing, as people know, has been declining globally as a share of employment for the past decade. But Australia has a range of niches in which we've traditionally done really well. One of those is advanced food manufacturing. Anyone who's spent time in Tasmania recently will have been struck by the fact that you're in one of the places that is doing food manufacturing best in the world. Not just high quality raw produce, but also really good value added and building up a lot of niche systems. We've also seen this with in the distilled liquor industry, particularly gin distilleries, finding niches that are appealing not just to Australia, but also to an overseas market, and building off the success of Australia's vineyards. There'll be other areas of high technology. Battery manufacture is one that's becoming increasingly attractive, given the lithium deposits in Western Australia and that the huge demand for more battery exports. Australia won't cover the field. I don't think it makes sense for us to try and do what Argentina once did and say we're only going to have locally made cars, locally made TVs, locally made smartphones. That way lies a very expensive approach, and one which ultimately hurts productivity because vehicles and computers are inputs to so much of the other manufacturing process. So you've got to recognise that just as most of us don't fix our own cars, make our own clothes or cut our own hair, we value comparative advantage in the labour market, and so too Australia should value comparative advantage in what we do in the world. Not try and do everything, but identify those niches where we can really succeed and where we can produce a lot of rewarding high-paying jobs.
Well, that may well be sage advice. I can, as someone who grew up in Geelong, I can remember some old Falcons, but I was very surprised when I first went to Argentina for any length of time in the 2000s to see the 1963 Australian Ford Falcon still being produced in Argentina, albeit with a lot of black paint to make it look modern. But it was, I was assured by someone I asked from Ford afterwards that yes, it was former panel presses from Geelong and some of the other machinery from Broadmeadows that had been sent over to Argentina, and they were still doing it. Not a very good product. But more seriously, you were saying, obviously, we shouldn't cover the field. The Argentinians were trying to cover the field, and perhaps in their own way were being non-discriminatory, but you're saying we should look at areas where we can specialise. That might smack, in some people's eyes, of picking winners, and you don't strike me as a person who's in the picking winners game, Andrew Leigh. So how do we find the sweet spot, as it were, so that we don't find ourselves going down the Argentine road, literally, or missing opportunities, because we do have a bit of a history of being a bit shy about engaging in the elaborate transformation of some of our resources products, even the basic transformation of some of our resources products.
Yeah, absolutely, David. And look, you've been working on this in this area for at least as long as I have, and know the challenges that we face. I think it's about taking a broad approach to both education and research funding. So in the case of education, allowing universities to expand places in areas where there's student demand, rather than micromanaging student places from the top. And in the case of research, recognising the value of a peer review process in which those who are working most closely with the cutting edge science are making the decisions about the next projects to be funded. Now, I was horrified, as was almost every researcher in Australia, when the government knocked off 6 Australian Research Council grants on the 24th of December 2021. Those grants included grants to work on China, on climate change and Shakespeare, knocked off, I think, just because the minister didn't like the titles. And we also have the spectacle of the Medical Research Future Fund, which is very much a black box funding mechanism driven out of the minister's office. And the danger with that kind of approach is that you get funding for projects that look attractive to a non-specialist, but not in fact
We just appear to have lost you a bit there, Andrew, but we're getting to the point where we're running close to time. If you can hear us, we've had a question from Peter Dowling, who's saying, okay, hear what you say about union membership, but union membership has declined to the point where it's now barely 1 in 7 workers. What strategies should we be adopting to increase union membership in the workforce and give unions a better say on these things? Well, everyone, I think unfortunately we're losing a bit of Andrew's connection. I know he's back here now. Andrew, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry about that. I'm going to blame that one on Wi-Fi, but not on the CSIRO.
Okay, a very good Australian invention, and which we're actually managing to benefit from the revenue stream for. Just when the Wi-Fi was playing up a bit there, Andrew, I was just asking a question that Peter Dowling had put. He's saying, he's obviously noted your points about the need for stronger union membership and a stronger voice for unions, but he's saying union membership's declined to the point where it's 1 in 7 workers. What strategies would you have to increase union membership in the broader workforce?
Peter, my Labor economics lecturer, Richard Freeman, used to characterise unionisation as a race between workers to unionise plants and employers to set up new plants. So he said this explains why unionisation is relatively high in the public sector and in big manufacturing enterprises, because they're areas where it's harder for the boss to go and set up a new establishment. Commensurately, it explains why unionisation tends to be quite low in small startup enterprises, because the enterprise has been built before the organising has been done. And that would explain why the unionisation rate in America, for example, is higher in Ford Motor Company than it is in the Amazon distribution centres. So partly it is about the set of laws that sit around union organising. And you see whenever Conservative governments are in office that they're just chipping away at every possible one they can do. Work choices or the industrial relations attempted changes under the coalition in this time they've been in office are all about making it harder for the representatives of organised labour. The Royal Commissions, the white-anting of unions in the public. And it's also vital that we've got better organising principles. There's a lot of interesting models in place. The HOSPO Voice, Young Workers Centre, and moves to ensure that people can join a union overall and have portability of membership across unions. Getting away from demarcation disputes, recognising that when unions make it easier for people to join up rather than having to decide which union they will join for a particular job, then the union membership rate is higher. So there's a lot of great thinking going on there. And I very much hope that's going to see a turnaround in the union membership rate, which frankly now for Australia is not much higher than in America. Our union membership rate is just a couple of percentage points above theirs. We're 14%, they're 11%. But if you go to New York or California, you're more likely to run into a union member than you are in Australia.
Interesting. Well, that's probably a conversation for another day. We might get you back on that because we'll be talking in a few weeks' time, I hope, with Anthony Forsyth from RMIT University, who's just put out a new book where he has some things to say about that sort of thing, along with some other panelists from the union movement. But it's where we have to end tonight. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's been a thorough, as one would expect, and wide-ranging, as one would also expect, conversation. As usual, you've put some views very firmly. I know that some will find it controversial, but I think it was very thought-provoking and very educative. So thank you very much, Andrew Leigh, for joining us tonight. Next week, we'll be reverting back to a Wednesday night format, and we'll be joined by former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, not to talk about the Ukraine, I must add, although I suspect we will get to touch on that. But Gareth has a new book out about the need for greater international citizenship. And he would argue that rather than purely focusing on events like the Ukraine or some of the controversy about our relationship with China, we need to be focusing about a range of things. And if we focused about a broader range of things in our, particularly our foreign policy, but also in our trade policy, we might actually make a better fist of dealing with some of the more specific events like the ones occupying us at the moment, and particularly this evening with what appears to be occurring in the Ukraine. So that will be Gareth Evans, 6 p.m. next Wednesday night. Look out for it. As usual, we'll post registration details on our social media and also send it out to our newsletter database. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Book, David, I can highly recommend it.
Good on you. Rightio. Good night, all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.